Welcome to Dusty Little Wastelanders, Chapter 13, Reunion. I was accompanied by a small gathering of folks while we marched to save the manor. Well, they marched to save the manor. I marched to save Kyle. The Dustnado had left so much evidence of its existence. My group and I were stepping over shanty walls that crowded the path. Personal belongings were strung throughout the entirety of Hillville. Clothes were hung up on scraps that had blown up against other shanties. Family portraits littered the floor with shattered frames. Any book that had met the Rager's path was blown to pages. We kept our way, headed for the manor. My boots crunched on shattered glass. My legs navigated around the shanty walls that strung throughout the town. My nose filled with that burning scent. Some citizens were running around, trying to gather their blown-away belongings. At least, I assumed it was their belongings. All sorts of thieves tended to surface in the wake of a Dustnado. I could count on one hand the amount of shanties that still stood. 3. They'd all been spared by some stroke of luck. We made it to the former gate of McDougal's manor. The Dustnado had left the door open for us. Maneuvering this close to the heart of the storm wasn't smart or easy. The folks I walked with got knocked on their asses. Some tumbled back one way while others were sucked into the fire by the vacuum current. They were all unmasked fools who die from dust consumption regardless. It might take its time, but it always got its victims. In some instances, like Mom and Daddy, it was a more immediate death, but those only resulted in extreme consumption. My heels dug into the dirt, moving 1 foot at a time and riding the wind, although riding wind this strong is more like riding a bull. It was aiming to knock me on my ass. I was the only one of my makeshift posse that made it through the blown-apart gates. Everyone else was either blown or sucked one way or the other. Amid this chaos, I kept my focus. A multitude of greenery flew past my face at all times. At least I'd managed to avoid shanty walls and personal belongings. For once, I was relieved by McDougal's seclusion. The bottom floor of the mansion was a complete blaze, but the slave station remained unburnt. Of course, the slave station wasn't heated and didn't have windows. It was practically a Dustnado shelter. I fought my way to the right. The wind beat down on me and the dust covered my body. A tree branch tore loose from its home and struck me with a vicious sting. Some trees had been smacked hard enough by the wild wind current to burst right in half. I'd never seen a current that strong. Something like that had reduced me to ground beef, and there was no predicting or dodging in any current. I had to shove that thought right out my ear. I kept my way towards the slave quarters, a single step at a time. Never before has such a short distance felt so vast. The blind noise of the storm suffocated any sounds from the air, probably for the best. I'd rather hear the storm than the shrieks of burn victims. Smoke was added to the list of things that I had to worry about consuming in excess. The bandana was good enough for dust, but I didn't know how well it would fare against smoke. The storm raged on and the wind rammed a log right into my chest. I crashed to my ass and tumbled through the gravel. Every cut on my glass-shredded skin cried out for mercy. My limbs flailed blindly in a cloud of black dust. It was as though Miss Nature herself had decided to add a cup of dust to this recipe. The blackness closed in and my hands disappeared, and my goal was no longer in sight. The winds continued to get angry. I went from the occasional branch slap to a straight-up ambush. Trying to regain my footing among the vicious wind and branch bombardment was a chore, but I made it. With my footing regained, I waited for a break in the gusting and committed back in the movement. A good-sized rock clocked me in the forehead and knocked me right onto my back. The fall took my breath away and I just lay there. Getting up was too much work. My body and my face were blood-covered. I felt like jerky just before swallowing. No more walking, my feet demanded. I turned on my stomach and pressed up onto my knees. They'd always taught me to stay low. Perhaps it was safer to travel on one's knees as well. Either way, getting vertical in the eye of the Rager had proven painful enough by this point. I crawled through the storm, like a peasant begging for rations. It was hard to keep my eyes off the manor. The storm was tearing it up and dumping dust through every crevice while the flames climbed the floors. My mind needed to stay single-focused, but it was too glorious to resist. Another loose branch slapped me back into focus. This one whipped right against my face. It stung like hell and formed another gash. It was clear that even when lying down, I couldn't hide from the branch barrage. I conceded to keep my focus on the slave station. The slave station was blurring back into focus. Either the storm was dying down, or I was finally getting close enough to my goal. I was hoping for the latter. The storm was stuck in time. Dustnados are constantly moving, although in the heat of the storm, they seemed as though they were just parked right here. I had to have been fighting through this manor for close to an hour now. The Rager should have passed through in half the time. My knees and elbows were beat all to shit. Crawling through the gravel would do that. Every inch ached at this point. So did my face after every branch slap, and my head split from squinting through these goggles so long. I made myself see the aches and pains as trivial. They were nothing compared to what Kyle had been through. I abandoned him for close to a month. That was unforgivable. My brother had been bagged, chained, sold, and forced into labor, and I had the nerve to complain about some aches and pains. Not anymore. This storm had no power over me. I was fueled by my brother's trials. I crumbled to the floor. I'd been shot, my legs thrashed, and my hand clenched at the point of contact. It was dry. No bleeding was a good sign. My rapid breathing had to be tamed through gritted teeth. I lay there for a moment to allow the shooting pain to diminish. Miss Nature had probably just thrown another rock my way. Navigating this storm was challenging enough. I propped back up on my aching knees and elbows. The crawl had to continue, and I had to block out these mundane aches and pains. The slave station door felt as though it was just a finger's length away. It was too close to be denied now. I wouldn't allow it. I felt it, a vacuum current, and it was here to pull me away from my goal. And judging by its general direction, I guess it aimed to add me in the pile of charred bodies in that fire. My muscles clenched to resist the pull. I tensed up. I did all the things, but there was no traction to be had in the middle of this gravel path. Try as I might, I was coming with that vacuum current, period. My knees curled and I sprang off to my toes, my arms outstretched for that gold doorknob. My quick efforts and gangly limbs came in handy. The distance between the knob and me was eliminated. Despite having a hold on the doorknob, the vacuum continued to suck. It was persistent and continued to pull. Damn determined to reduce me to kingling, but I was damn determined to resist. Whose determination was stronger, Miss Nature or my own? I knew it was Miss Nature, but I was hoping she'd give me this one. I deserved it, damn it. My hands clung to the knob as if they were Kyle's hands, the vacuum a manifestation of the people who tried to pull us apart. But I had a hold of Kyle this time, and I wasn't letting go. Miss Nature conceded, the vacuum current ceased. She did make sure to toss another branch in my face. It burned from being caught on fire, but the burns were something I could endure. Just a different kind of scar on my marred face. The current was gone, and my grip around the knob remained true. It was time to break into this slave station. I twisted and yanked the knob, but the door did not budge. It wasn't locked. Damn wind! It was stuck. My goal was within grasp, but until the wind lightened up, I wouldn't be able to budge this door. Its hinges were mounted to swing my way, so although kicking the door would feel incredible, it wouldn't serve any productive purpose. But anger management seemed pretty productive at this time, so I kicked the hell out that door. Maybe someone on the other end would take it as knocking and would answer. Doubt the slaves had freedom enough to do even that. I was stuck on this door until further notice. I turned back to the mansion. The fire had spread to the second floor. The storm had moved to the back half of the manor. Just a few more minutes and I'd be out of the eye. Wind currents were less intense the further the storm got away. And technically, the storm was losing force from the moment of its conception, right off the bat. That's how they worked. They'd rage until they were all out. I'd bet I'd be in the clear by the time the storm reached TJ's collection of shanties. Hopefully TJ had gotten the hell out of there by now. Dustnadoes knew no mercy and wrecked shanties like a pig slop. My mind navigated back to the people at the bar. I was really only worried about K2. I hoped I got to him in time. It was wild to think that Esther had been my old kindergarten teacher this whole time. Probably never figured it out without hints. Kyle would be thrilled to see Mr. Williams again. Not just Mr. Williams, but our whole posse. I wonder what he was thinking when he thought of Donald and TM. In a few minutes, I'd ask him. Just a few more minutes. We'd been separated for I didn't know how long. Too long. Should I do the right thing and wait for a couple more minutes? Or should I let go of this doorknob and look for another way in? I already knew there weren't any windows, but what about another door? There my mind went again, forming new plans when it wasn't necessary to do so. Should have paid more attention to this building when I had the chance. I closed my eyes. The storm's wind flooded my mind. Just wait, a woman called out to me. Who? I could not identify, but I listened. I'd say it was Mom if I had to guess. Several minutes had never passed so slow. My hands were numb for keeping such a tight hold on this doorknob. I tried not to watch the storm. Watching the storm wasn't any good way to pass the time. My mind slipped into wondrous thoughts of my time with Kyle after these trials. We'd have to go get red apples. Kyle loved red apples. Then maybe TM, Kyle and I could stargaze a couple of nights. We'd definitely have to go sleeping bag shopping. I was sure Donald was dying to show off Monica to Kyle. And of course, Esther and K2 would have to be all over the fun too. Boy, how our posse has grown. A rush of branches pummeled me silly. Miss Nature was telling me to wake up and focus. There was no sense of daydreaming about my time with Kyle anymore. Kyle was one doorway away from me. One doorway away from turning my daydreams into reality. I gave the door a tug and was knocked onto my back. I wasn't expecting it, but the door had opened. It blew open with a force that knocked me on my ass, but I now forced a way in. I scrambled into the shelter and slammed the door behind me. I stood to face forward. This place plastered the makeup.
Hey there, what's up? LL Smith here. Thank you so much for enjoying my audiobook. I'm going to interrupt you real quick and say, if you get real anxious to hear what happens next and just can't wait till next week, or if you get the urge to just support such a stunning, ruggedly handsome, and awesome independent creator such as myself, I encourage you highly to go follow the link in the description and support the official release. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right back into that story.
I stood to face forward. This place plastered the makeup on the outside to hide the ugly on the inside. It was one overbuilt space, no amenities, no privacy, and no freedom. The floors were dirt covered in hay and padding for comfort, I'd assume. The slaves were chained to these posts. Each slave had a collar around their neck, which was chained to the pole, and then cuffs around their hands and ankles, which were also fixed to the pole. There was a single guard in this whole place, and he was approaching from the corner of the room. "Hey," he greeted me. "I've secured the slaves and am monitoring to see that they don't escape." He'd mistaken me for someone else. He got closer. I shoved Daddy into his Adam's apple and just about carved it out. The man dropped, and I kept the old carver in my grips. "I told you you'd get one, Daddy," I spoke to the carver. I watched the sea of prisoners who just witnessed my murder. The hope in their eyes was moving. I could only imagine how they felt when faced with someone who could rescue them. "Them" was not an accurate description for all I planned to save. I came here just for one man, and as much as I'd like to free them all, I didn't have that kind of time. "Kyle!" I called out. There was no response. I began my walk through the droves of slaves. "Help us!" they begged. "Free me!" they pleaded. "Please, sir!" they asked. Their pathetic words were louder than that storm. My arm was tugged. I looked over. A slave had grabbed a hold of it. "Please!" he begged. "Calm down," I said, trying to pull my arm free of his grip. My leg was soon snagged, and I looked down at another slave, too weak to stand but plenty strong enough to cling to my leg. "You have to help!" he whimpered. "Let go!" I commanded. I had to weave out the reach of another clinging slave. I struggled to tug free of their desperate grip. All their strength was being poured into this desperate attempt at freedom. "Kyle!" I called out. "Enry?" A voice responded, too quiet to locate, but distinct enough to identify. "Kyle!" I repeated. "Enry, I'm over here," the voice continued. I still struggled with these clinging slaves. Daddy went to work. He severed several fingers, and I got the point across. I felt like filth, but it needed to be done. "Thank you," I said to my carver. "Go and get your brother," I heard Daddy's response. "All right, shut up, all you," I demanded, turning from savior to threat. After lopping off some clingers and bellowing some orders, the slaves quieted down. I still searched through the army of slaves. There was no telling where Kyle was, but at least now I was quiet enough to think. However, with the raging storm outside, I doubt I could still make out Kyle's location based upon his whimpers. My eyes followed some whines. The slave who clung to my leg mourned the loss of his fingers. He sat on the ground weeping. He sat. There it was. "Everyone in here, sit down now," I commanded. "Kyle, stay standing." I watched as the slaves obliged. Their compliance was sickening. They'd been beaten and pushed past the point of resistance. In waves, the sea of slaves began to disappear and form in my view as they rested on the ground. My head spun around, searching the room. I was too excited to wait for all the slaves to sit down. I need to find Kyle now. I didn't see him in the left side of the room. I turned to the right, and it was him. It had to be. I had spotted him from the crowd, and he refused to sit down. I flailed myself at him. My careless limbs stepped on hands, bumped into bodies, and shoved into slaves. I bullied my way through that crowd. My excessive bull rush was halted once I got close. I glared at the shell of a person before me. He was so thin, so frail, and his expression was sunken. I approached him with care. I didn't want to barrel at him just as I'd barreled through all those other slaves in my wake. Each step brought a new heart-wrenching discovery. There were patches of scalp on his head. They'd yanked out his blonde hair and taken flesh with it. I'd make him choke on my fists if I were given the chance. Some other savage, or perhaps even the same assailant, had left teeth marks down his arms, like little brands on my brother's captor. I was ready to chew a chunk out of that savage's jugular. His feet, bare, bloodied, blistered. That I could help. I'd packed a fresh pair of socks before leaving the bar. His clothes were packed heavy with dust, but it didn't seem to come from the storm, so I assumed he was safe from excessive inhalation. I looked over the series of chains that held my brother's freedom. "That guard has the keys," Kyle whimpered. I didn't want to leave my brother again. I wanted to hold Kyle forever, but he needed his freedom. I sprinted back through the crowd and was over to the entrance. I tried to be more mindful of people's limbs this time around. They're also a lot more cautious of my approach. I found the dead guard and retrieved the keys from his belt. I ran back to Kyle and fished through the key ring looking for the right one. "It's the tiny silver one," Kyle instructed, void of gusto. I found it. I inserted it into his shackles and officially freed my brother. Kyle fell into my arms and I caught him and held him against my heart. I handed the keys to the nearby slave and turned my attention back to Kyle. He looked up at me with his blue eyes full of water and a weak face twinging with sniffles. It was my mother's face still. Despite the mental and physical deformities, he still featured our own mother's visage. "Enry, I was wrong," he choked out. I wrapped myself around Kyle, as warm and as tight as I felt he could stand. All his fears, his pain, his suffering, everything. I wanted to shoulder it all. "I wanted you to be right," I said. "I wanted you to be right." End of chapter 13.